Today's daf is Chulin daf Lamed Aleph, and we are at the Mishnah on daf Lamed Amid Beis. So a loaded daf. Zok the Mishnah, Hashoichet Beis Roshin Ke'echad. Somebody was shechting, and with one slice, he shechted two animals. Says the Mishnah, Shchitasek Sheir. Shnayim oichsim besakin. If two people were holding onto a knife, the shechtin, and they shechted together, afilu echad l'mayla v'echad l'mata, even if one shechted on the top of the simanim, the other one on the bottom of the simanim, Shchitasek Sheir, the shchita is going to be kosher. We saw already in yesterday's daf, the Gemara discussed this part of the Mishnah, and the Gemara brought a machlekes on Meiram how to understand this part of the Mishnah. Does the Mishnah mean Shnayim oichsim besakin? As in Shnayim Oichsim Betalis, two people are holding on to the very same knife. One person is holding it on top, the other person is holding it on the bottom. Or does the Mishnah mean Shnayim Oichsim Besakin? There are two people holding on to different knives, and they're both shechting at the same time. Regardless, the Mishnah says Ksher Hittis Es Haroish Bevachs Achas Psula. If the Shoichet, rather than shechting in a slicing motion, he shechted in a chopping motion. Rashi says the way somebody would cut a piece of meat or the way somebody would cut a vegetable, the halach is it's psula. This is what's known as drasa, as we've mentioned many times. This is one of the five halachas l'Moshe Misinai that govern the laws of shchita. If the person shechted, meaning he wasn't doires, he didn't press, he didn't cut the animal the way you cut a vegetable. Rather, he sliced. However, v'hittis es harosh bevaz achas, and in one slice, he severed the simanim of the animal, as opposed to what? As opposed to being moilech umevi, right? The perfect shchita is, you're moilech and you're mevi. So what this person did was, he was moilech, but he wasn't mevi. Or we'll see in the end of the Mishnah, he was mevi and he wasn't moilech. So he wasn't doires, but at the same time, he wasn't moilech umevi. Says the Mishnah, it depends. It depends on the length of the knife to determine whether this is going to be a kosher shchita. If the length of the knife is like the width of the neck of the animal, and the Gemara is going to explain, what it means is that there's an additional length of the knife that equals the width of the animal. So it has to be 2 times the width of the neck of the animal in order for it to be kosher. If it's smaller than that, it's going to be possible. If somebody was shechting and he shechted 2 animals at the same time, the first line of the Mishnah said, but what this person did was, he wasn't moilech mevi, he was only moilech, or he was only mevi. So there the halach is, just like we said in the previous case, that if you're moilech and you're not mevi, it could be it's going to be kosher as long as the knife is long enough. How long does it have to be? In addition to the width of the neck of the animal, it has to be another maloy tzavar. It has to be the width of the neck of a second animal. That's going to be true if you're shechting one animal. It's also going to be true if you're shechting 2 animals. Meaning, there would have been a havamina that if you're shechting one animal, then the additional length of the knife should be k'meloy tzavar behema echad. But if you're shechting 2 animals, maybe the additional length of the knife has to be k'meloy tzavar of 2 animals. Kamash malon, that if it's one ma'aser shchita, it just has to be an additional meloy tzavar. In that case, it's going to be kosher. And the Mishnah says again, all this conversation of how long the knife has to be is but if you did a proper shchita, you were moilech umevi, afilu kolshu, even if the knife is very, very small, we'll see what that means, afilu bizemel, even if you use a scalpel, ksheira, the halach is, it's going to be kosher. So we have another very important Mishnah that discusses shchita 101, the basic halachas of how shchita has to be done. Number 1, we saw a halach in the Mishnah that you could shech 2 animals with 1 swoop. Additionally, shnai moichsen besakin, whatever that means, shchita soy ksheira. The Mishnah mentioned the halacha of drasa, that shchita has to be beis simanim, roiv the beis simanim, but you're not allowed to press against the simanim. You can't be doires, but rather what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to be moilech umevi. Now, if you do it in the way you're supposed to do it, you're moilech umevi. Doesn't matter what the size of the knife is, it's always going to be kosher. Afilu kolshu, the Mishnah says, even an izemel, even a scalpel, that's not a knife, even something like that, as long as it's sharp enough to sever the simanim without causing the animal to be a treifa before you sever the simanim, it's going to be kosher. In the event that you weren't dairis, you also weren't moilech umevi, so you didn't mess up, it wasn't drasa, but you also didn't do the perfect shchita. You were moilech, but you were mevi, or you were mevi and you were moilech. Is it kosher? It depends on the length of the knife. If the knife is long enough that, in addition to the width of the neck of the animal, it has an additional width of the neck of the animal. It's an addition in Beloit Saber Behema. Doesn't matter if you were shechting one animal, if you were shechting two animals. The halacha is that it's going to be kosher. If it's smaller than that, it's going to be possible. How do you know that the perfect shechita is moilach umevi? It's learned that from the following pasuk. It says chetz shachot l'shoinam mirma diber. So we compare shechita to an arrow, and just like an arrow, you moilach umevi, you pull back the strings of the. Why should I want to just tell this guy? You pull back the strings of the bow, and that causes the chetz, the arrow, to move forward. So there's a moilach umevi concept. So too, shechita has to be done in that way. The Rabbi Yishmael, v'shachat, when it says in the pasuk v'shachat, ein v'shachat ela umashach. The word v'shachat means umashach. You have to be moilach umevi. How do you know that? So there's two psukim. Number one, the pasuk says zahav shachot, and this is a pasuk in Malachim Aleph. And pashut, what it means over there is it's beaten up gold. So what the smiths used to do is they would beat up gold, they would soften it, and then they would schlep it in different directions depending on the form that they wanted the gold to take on. So you see, the word shachot means to be moishech. And the pasuk says chetz shachot l'shoinam mirma diber. The pasuk that we brought previously, that shechita is like a chetz, and just like a chetz, you take the bowstring, you pull it. That causes the chetz to move forward. There's a moilach umevi concept. Shechita is moilach umevi. I mean, why do you need two psukim for? Because had we only had the first pasuk zav shachot, you would think that maybe the word shachot over there doesn't mean beaten. It's not milashon. You're going to be moishech the zav in the direction that you want to form it, but rather maybe the word shachot is made up of two words. It's shechut. It's from the word chut, a thread. And maybe the point is that it was referring to gold that was spun like a thread. Tashma, that's why we have a second pasuk that says chetz shachut. The context over there is not zahav. The context over there is a chetz, and you see we compare the chetz to shchita. Thus, just like the chetz has the moilach umevi motion, so too shchita has the moilach umevi motion. Says the Gemara, Rava have a badik like gira the Rabbi Yoinat bar Tachlifa. Rava was once baidik an arrow for Rabbi Yoina bar Tachlifa. V'shachet ba'ufa bahada the parach, and he shechted an oif, a bird, while it was flying. So he was demonstrating shchita for Rabbi Yoina bar Tachlifa, and he says, "Watch what I could do." So he took an arrow. He was baidik to make sure there were no pigimos. You have to be baidik a sakin. From Avinu by the Akedah, you have to be baidik a sakin. So he checked the arrow under the sun, right? It was perfect. And now he says, take a look. And there was a bird that was flying. He shot the bird. Perfect shchita. He nailed the siman. Says the Gemara, how in the world could Rava be soymech on such a shchita? Why aren't you worried that even if after he saw the bird, he saw that he hit it perfectly, and it was a perfect shechita, but maybe the arrow went into the bird first, then it shechted the siman, which we know is not good. That's chalada. Chalada means it was borrowed. You have to make sure that you shecht it from the outside, not from the inside. So the Gemara says, Chazina gitfi the mifrim. He was able to see from the feathers that the incision came from the outside, it wasn't from the inside. He was shechting a bird, an oif, like a chaya requires kisei hadam. So the blood must have splattered all over the place. So how did he do kisei hadam? Says the Gemara, maybe when he collected the blood, right, then he was able to pull it together. But the halacha is that for kisei hadam, it's not enough that you cover with dirt. It has to be offer underneath it as well. Shem, as the pasuk says, you learn from there, you have to sandwich the blood in between the offer. And we learn from there that what you need to do is you need to prepare offer initially, right? Because technically all the ground is offer, right? For the most part. But Rashi says you need offer tichayach. You need loose offer, soft offer, which would have had to been prepared previously. It doesn't sound like Rava prepared offer for him to be able to do the kisei hadam. Says the Gemara, you have to say the mazman leila offer, the kulu piska. No, Rava prepared for this. Everything was set up. He knew what he was trying to do. He knew that the blood was going to splatter. So he had all the offer tikayach in already. He did a perfect shechita. He was able to see from the feathers that there was no chalada. He used an arrow, which is a chiddush, that you could use an arrow even though it's not a sakin. The bottom line is, says the Gemara, Rava have a badik le gira le Rabbi Yoina bar Tachlifa. I saw in the Sha'an Mitzion Malacha, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Braun. He says that don't tell too this Maisa to the children from the Reit of Yehuda that we always speak out. And you're there, Tinyana Simon Yud. Are you allowed to go hunting? So the Reit of Yehuda says a Jew shouldn't hunt because that was Maisa Esav, that was Maisa Nimrod. It sounds like Rabba's hunting. So he says obviously this was different. He was demonstrating Hilchas Shchita. I thought that was worth mentioning. Either way, Rab Zera said. So we saw in the Mishnah that let's say somebody shechted and he wasn't Moilech Umevi. So the perfect shechita is Moilech Umevi. It's supposed to be like the chetz, just like the chetz. Your Moilech Umevi. That's the way the shechita is supposed to be. It's supposed to be chetz shachat, but at the same time, it still could be kosher if you were a Moilech Umevi. How so? The Mishnah said that if the sakin was Meloit Savar, it was the length equal to the width of the neck of the animal, that would make it kosher. So Rab Zera said that the way you have to read the Mishnah is Meloit Savar v'chutz l'tzavar, meaning it has to be equal to the Meloit Savar, but it has to be even longer than that. How much longer? It has to be an additional Meloit Savar, meaning the way you read the Mishnah is if the sakin has an additional Meloit Savar, it's going to be kosher, meaning it has to be equal to Treit Savari. Maybe it means a mashu more. Tashma. The Mishnah said that if somebody shechted two animals at the same time, which the Mishnah, the first line of the Mishnah said is okay, so here the Mishnah doesn't say here it adds the word echad. Says the Gemara, what is the word echad? It doesn't mean that the knife just has to be Meloit Savar Echad. That can't be. Because Hashtab Behema Achas Buin Meloit Savar V'chutz L'Tzavar. Because Reb Zera said that when you're shechting one behema and you're going to be Moilech V'loi Hevi or Hevi V'loi Moilech, it has to be more than a Meloit Savar, then B'shtei Behema Sagdum Meloit Savar Echad, then it's pashut that if you're shechting two animals, it has to be more than a Meloit Savar Echad. Elopshita. When the Mishnah says Meloit Savar Echad, it means Meloit Savar Chutz L'Shnei Tzavarim. In addition to it being the length of two tzavarim, because in this case you're shechting two animals, it has to be an additional Meloit Savar. If that's the case, then in the Resha, when you're shechting only one animal, and we said it has to be more than the Meloit Savar. How much more? Shema mino, Meloit Savar, Chutz L'Tzavar, Shema mino. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is if you're Moilech Umevi, it doesn't matter how small the knife is. It could be a scalpel, it could be a mashu, as we'll see in the Gemara in a second. Anything is going to be kosher. If you were Moilech V'loi Hevi, Hevi V'loi Moilech, then it depends on the length of the knife. How long does the knife have to be? So it has to be 2 times the length of the neck of the animal that you're shechting. So whatever that is, that's the shear, that's how much you have to have. The chiddush that the Mishnah said is that if you're shechting 2 animals at the same time, all you need is 1 Meloit Savar extra. You don't need a Meloit Savar extra for each animal that you're shechting. But if you were Moilech Umevi, what did the Mishnah say? Last line, Afilu Kol Shahu, Afilu Be'izemel Ksher. Rabbi Nasha said that when the Mishnah says in Izemel is kosher, it means in Izemel a scalpel she'in lo karnayim, that has no horns. So Rashi says Regilin hayulasos kemin Karnayim le'azmilin le'noi al gabei matel roshon. So they used to put these little horns, little protrusions on the top of the scalpels. It was done le'noi, simply because it made it look nice. Now those karnayim, if you're going to shecht with it, it's a little hook, and we're afraid that it may go into the siman and it may render the animal a treifa before you're able to do a kosher shchita. So the only time it's kosher to use an izemel is if it's an izemel she'en lo karnayim. Are you allowed to use a needle? Amalei mechta mizda baza. No, you can't use a needle because we're afraid that it's going to make a nick and it's like a pagam. It's going to cause the animal to be a treifa. Machta de ushbechimai. What about the needles or the blades that people that made leather used to use? So Rashi says, Miratzeya haratzonim, shepiyosav chedudim, the sides of it are very, very sharp. V'choitchin chutei atvar. They used to cut leather with it. So that's a different type of instrument. Is that kosher? Amalei tanina, I think yes. You know why? Because the Mishnah says, afilu kolshu. The Mishnah says that if you were Moilech Umevi, a kolshu is kosher and an izemel is kosher. My love, what does kolshu mean? It's coming to be marba something. Presumably, machta the ushbechi. It's probably what's coming to be marbe that. In other words, even though it's not mefurish anywhere, but I think that's what the Mishnah means when it says kosher. But the Gemara says, "Lie." Maybe what the Mishnah means when it says kosher is izemel. Right? The Gemara izemel bad law. The Mishnah says izemel. The Mishnah says afilu kosher, afilu bizemel. So the Gemara says prusha kama farish. Maybe the way you read the Mishnah is my kosher izemel. Meaning, really, the Mishnah is saying one thing. It's not talking about this machta the ushbechi. When it says kosher, it means izemel, and the Mishnah, which it sometimes does, is mefarish what it says. It says if you were melech maybe anything is okay, meaning even in izemel, and it just explained that by adding the words because if you're going to tell me the machta is okay, once the Mishnah says the machta the ushbechi is good, apparently the machta the ushbechi is a bigger chiddush that you can use for shchita than in izemel was. But the Gemara says it's not right because izemel is shrichele. It could be even had the Mishnah told me machta the ushbechi, you wouldn't know izemel. So I would have thought that izemel's worse. What do you mean? It's a sharper blade, it's a cleaner blade. The reason is because the Gemara had previously said that only certain izemels are kosher. In izemel that doesn't have those hooks, but in izemel that has the karnayim is not kosher. Memela solka daita chamina. I would have thought ligzar izemel she'ein like karnayim, atu izemel she'yesh like karnayim. Kamash malon. The bottom line is that we have no raya one way or the other from the Mishnah whether this machta the ushbechi is okay or it's not okay. Weiter. Again, this is a loaded daf, and depending on how much time we have at the end, we'll see how much raid we have an opportunity to speak at. Either way, Zok the Mishnah, festing Gemara. Nafla sakin. If a sheiche was holding a knife and then the knife slipped out of his hand, oops. V'shachta, and lo and behold, it's shechted. Perfect money shchita. Afal pisha shachta kedarka psula. The halachas is possible. Shenemar v'zavachta v'yachalta, and we learn from there masha ata zayveach ata oichel, and the emphasis on ata v'zavachta. Thou shalt shecht. It has to come mikoyach gavra. You have to do a maisa that causes the shchita to go into effect. But if the shchita happens on its own because the knife slipped out of your hand, the halacha is it's not going to be a kosher shchita. Thus, nafla sakin v'shachta, afal pisha shachta shchita ksher. Says the Gemara, a very obvious and a very profound diak. Time of the nafla. It sounds like from the Mishnah that the only reason this shchita was not good is because the sakin literally slipped out in the hands of the person that was holding it. Ha hipila. What would be if the person would have thrown the sakin on the ground without any intention of doing shchita? It would have came mikoyach gavra. It sounds like sheira. It would have been kosher. Right? The issue is that it wasn't masha ato zoiveach ato oichel. You didn't do the ma'aseh shchita. It fell out of your hand. There was no koyach gavra. You didn't even perform an action. There was no maisa. But let's say you would do a maisa without intending to do a shchita. You would throw it on the ground because you're upset. And lo and behold, there was an animal there, and you shechted roiva the two simanim, and it was perfect. Where was the Moilech Humevi, by the way? It was a long knife. You don't have to have the Moilech Humevi. It sounds like it would be okay. Even though you had no kavanah to do shchita. So the Gemara, man tana being kavanah to shchita. Who's the tana that holds that you don't need kavanah to shchita? I'm a Rav Nasan. It's Rav Nasan. The tani uishi is the irid. If somebody was throwing a knife, he wanted it to stick in a wall. The whole v'shachta kedarka, and on its way, en route to the wall, it encountered an animal, and it did a perfect shchita. Rav Nasan machsher v'chachavim poisel. Rav Nasan says it's kosher because you don't need kavanah to do shchita. The Chachamim say it's possible because you do need kavanah to do shchita. Said Rava, Rav Nasan, who holds you don't need kavanah to do shchita, he's the Tan of our Mishnah. Because according to the Chachamim, that you need kavanah to do shchita, even for shchita Chulin, it should come out then even if the person threw the knife to the ground. It wasn't just nafla. Even then it would be possible. The Mishnah's mashma, only nafla is possible. Ha pila is kosher. Rava, so Rava said it must be the time of the Mishnah is Rab Nasan. And by the way, the Gemara says, who tanila? For who amala? Rava continued, and Rava said, Allah to Rab Nasan. Freak the Gemara. Why did Rava have to make this diak in our Mishnah and point out that the Stam Mishnah is Rab Nasan and that the Allah is like Rab Nasan? Rava said it already earlier in the Masechta. Time we learned in the Mishnah, the very first Mishnah in the Masechta, Hakol Sheichte Shchitasam Ksheira Chutz Micher Sheichte. Then the Mishnah says, V'kulan Sheshachdu V'Achein Roi Noisam Shchitasam Ksheira. That even Acher Sheichte that are considered Lav B'nei Das, if they do a Shchita and Acher Maroi Noisam, it's going to be okay. V'Amrin, and the Gemara said, Man Tanad Loi Kavan L'Shchita. Obviously, if Acher Sheichte can do Shchita, they could be a God Loimet Al Gaba from today till tomorrow. They don't have Das. So what do you see from here? That you don't need Kavan of a Shchita. Rava said, yep, it's a great diak, and Rav Nosson he. And the time of the first Mishnah was Rav Nosson. So, L'chura, why would Rava have to comment and say that the Stam Mishnah in Chulin Daf Lamed Aleph is Rav Nosson, if he already commented and said that the Stam Mishnah in Chulin Daf Beis Lamed Aleph is Rav Nosson? Why do Rava have to make this diak twice? Says the Gemara Tzricha. Yashmin and Hassam, because had we only had the Mishnah on Daf Beis, I would have thought Mishum dekam mechavim l'shum chaticha ba'oila. Because at the very least, the Chereshayt of a Katan are having kavana to shecht. But over here, where a person just threw the knife to the ground, you would have thought that even Rav Nosson holds it's not okay. That's why Rava wanted to make the diak and point out that according to Rav Nosson that you don't need kavana, even if you didn't have kavana to do anything. You just had kavana to throw a knife on the floor. That's also going to be okay. V'yashmin and hachad, we only had this diak. I would have thought Mishum Dekasim Mikaich Ben Das. Then maybe the only time Rav Nosson's halach is true that you don't need kavana is if at the very least the person who did the ma'aseh shchita, albeit without kavana, was someone that is a ben das. But in the case of a Chereshayt of a Katan, Dekasim Mikaich Ben Das, where they are physically not bnei das, you would think that makes it worse, and even according to Rav Nosson, it won't be okay. Tzricha, that's why Rava wanted to clarify that when Rav Nosson said that shchita loy bayi kavana, it means that even if the person doing the shchita is a Chereshayt v'katan, that's not even capable of having das. And it means even if you didn't have any kavana to do any ma'aseh, you weren't even trying to throw nothing. You just threw it on the ground. That's all you did. It doesn't matter. Rav Nosson shita is that shchitas chulin is loy bayi kavana. So the Gemara is going to digress now for about an amid, and then at the end of the daf we're going to see why the Gemara did what it did. Itmar nida shenensa v'tafla. We're discussing a woman who's a nida. She has to go to the mikvah in order to become tar. She went to the mikvah, but she went to the mikvah ba'oines. So at the very end of the daf, it's really going to be on tomorrow's daf. The Gemara is going to explain exactly what the case was with this nida shenensa. But for now, all we need to know is that this nida ended up in a mikvah, but she ended up in the mikvah ba'oines. The question is, does the tefillah work or does the tefillah not work? A tefillah of a tamei ba'oines. Shema tefillah, aloy shema tefillah. Geshmaki Gemara. I'm Rav Rav. So Rav Yehuda said, I heard from Rav Tahira Lebeisa that the halacha is as follows. She's considered Tahira Lebeisa, meaning she's mutter b'tashmish. Rashi says she's allowed to go back to her husband, but vasura lecha b'truma. But at the same time, if she's an Eishes Kayin, she wouldn't be able to eat truma. Rabbi Yochanan says after Beis like Tahira, she's not allowed to eat truma. She's not allowed to go to her husband at all. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, a tefillah ba'onis is not a tefillah at all. According to Rav, it depends. As it relates to truma, it's not considered a tefillah. As it relates to her husband, it's considered Rav Nachman. So Rav told Rav Nachman, the Rav, according to Rav, it doesn't make sense. You know why? Oven karis hutra. A nida to her husband is an isakaris. A tamei, a nida that eats truma is chayim misa b'dei shamayim. We know that karis and misa b'dei shamayim are not the same thing. In fact, karis is more chamor than misa b'dei shamayim. So how's it possible that she's allowed to go to her husband, meaning it's considered a tefillah for the isser chamor of karis, but she's not allowed to eat truma? It's not considered a tefillah as it relates to the isser kal of misa b'dei shamayim. Amalei. So Rav Nachman told Rav, this has nothing to do with chamor or kal. That's not the point. The point is not one is more chamor than the other. Because if that's the case, you're right. A nida being with her husband is much more chamor than a nida eating truma. You know what the point is? By chulin, her husband is chulin. V'chulin loy by kavana. Truma is kachim, and kachim requires kavana. Meaning, Rav held that a tameh whose toivel shaloi midas, it's a tefillah legabe in yonei chulin. It's not a tefillah regarding in yonei kachim. So a woman towards her husband, that's a shaila in hilchas chulin. Hilchas chulin shma tefillah. As it relates to truma, that's hilchas kachim. As it relates to kachim, loish, says the Gemara, no, teimra. We need a makar for this. Here's the digression. We learned in the Mishnah, gal shen nitlash. Somebody was standing on the side of the ocean, and then this monster wave came. Ubayar bam sa. It had 40 sa. The gal was a wave. It detached itself from the ocean. There's 40 sa. It's coming. There was a man standing on the side of the ocean, and he was standing next to Kalim, and it fell on him. If he was tameh, or if the Kalim were tameh, the halach is tahir. Everybody is tahir. Says the Gemara, my lab, Adam dumi the Kalim. The Mishnah put Adam and Kalim together. It sounds like that there's some shaykhs between the two as it relates to how they become tahir. Do Kalim have kavana when they go into the mikvah to become tar? No, because Kalim says Rashi are less fluidas. So maybe we can prove from here that Adam doesn't need kavanah either. But the Gemara says, how do you know that? Maybe we're talking about a person who's waiting, he's hoping, when's this wave going to finally come? He wants the wave to fall on him because he wants to be tahar. In other words, he is having kavanah, right? He's saying, and if that's the case, and he has kavanah, we can prove just the opposite. Maybe Adam has to have kavanah. Maybe Kalim also, the only time to come tar, it's true that Kalim can't have kavanah, but maybe the owner of the Kalim has to have kavanah. But the Gemara says, the chitem, if you're going to tell me what's the chiddush of this case? There's some chiddush in this story, that a person was waiting for a wave to fall on him, or he wasn't waiting, but the point is, there's some sort of chiddush that this is a good taira. Bishlama, if you're supposed to walk away from this Mishnah saying Adam the Kalim, and just like Kalim don't have das, so too Adam doesn't have to have das, that's a chiddush. There's a chiddush that you don't have to have das when you're mitahir yourself in a mikvah. But if you're going to tell me you do have to have das when you mitahir yourself in a mikvah, so what then is the chiddush of the Mishnah? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what the chiddush is. In fact, I'll tell you two chiddushim. Number one, the time I would have thought ligzar mishum chardalis shel geshamim. The halacha is that if it's raining and now there's rainwater that's coming down a mountain, very, very fast, and you're standing on the bottom of the mountain, there's 40 saw of rainwater, it falls on you. The halach is you're not tahar, because megishamim is only mitahar if it's in one place. But if it's running water, it's what's known as zoichalin, the halach is it doesn't work. And being that this wave is eerily similar to the rainwater that's coming down the mountain, so maybe you would have thought that this whole case of the Mishnah is dead on arrival, because you would think that this Gal Shen Nitlash is too similar to the Chardalish Al Geshamim. And that's the Chiddush of the Mishnah, that it's okay, Inami. Another chiddush is ligazer Russian atu keeping, because as we'll see in a moment, the only time it's kosher if someone's metayr himself or his kalim in the wave is if the person stays on the ground or the kali's on the ground, and then the tip of the wave lands on the person while he's on the ground. But let's say you have this galsha nitlash, this 40 sa, this monster wave that's up in the air, and you have a kali that's tummy, so you throw the kali into the gal. The halach is it's not going to be tahar. So another chiddush, the chiddush is you would have thought that being that it only works in lamdis and hilchas mikvah if you're on the ground, but it doesn't work if you throw it into the air. So maybe we should be geyser Russian when you're on the floor, atu keepin when it's in the air. By the way, how do you know that the only time this galshan nitlash works is if the keli or the person's on the ground but not in the air? It's a mafurish mishnah. Matpilim berushin, ve'in matpilim bekeepin, and the reason is she'ein matpilim ba'aver. The bottom line is that we have no raya from this Mishnah in Mesechtes Mikvos that's discussing the Galshan Nitlash to this Shaila, whether Tefillah requires Kavanah or Tefillah does not require Kavanah. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, we need a Makar. How do you know that Tefillah for Chulin does not require Kavanah? So the Gemara says that Tanan, we know from another Mishnah, a Mishnah Mesechtes Machshirin, Peiros Shenaflu L'toicha Masamayim. Somebody had fruit, Peiros, and they fell into water. Upasha Misha Yadav Tmeis, and then the person went into the water, stuck his hands in, he wanted to pull the fruit out. Just so happens that his hands were tameh, v'natlan, and he pulled the fruit out. Allah is Yadav Tahiris. His hands now become tar. Why? Because his hands were in water. And even though he didn't have kavanah to clean his hands, why did he put his hands in the water? To pull the fruit out. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, his hands became tar. What about the fruit? Einam b'chiyutan. The halacha is that if later a sheretz, one of the shmeina shratzim, falls on top of the fruit are not huchsha l'kabel tuma. What do you mean they became wet? Because the halacha is that the only time fruit becomes huchsha l'kabel tuma is if the fruit were first wet, but you were nicha, you were happy, you were satisfied with the fact that it became wet. In this case, there was no satisfaction. Number one, when the fruit fell into the water, it just fell in. You weren't even happy about it. You right away wanted to pull it out. Now you'll tell me, we had this earlier in Mesechtes Chulin, and this is Machshira 101, that for chiyutan you don't need to be satisfied with the water on the fruit. As long as you're satisfied with something becoming wet, that in and of itself is enough. So maybe you can make the argument that the fruit should be huchsha l'kabel toma, because when you put your hands into the water, your hands became tahar. So there's a nichusa now from the water, albeit on your hands, and that should then say that if that same water was on the fruit, as it was, now the fruit is Chulin Kabatuma. But that doesn't work. You know why? Because when you stuck your hands into the water, you never had das to be matar your hands either. That's something that you found out later. But you never had kavanah. So there was never a nichusa. There was no nichusa for the fruit to become clean. There was no nichusa for your hands to become tahar. As a result, even though your hands are tahar, because you don't need das for your hands to be tahar, but peris ain't a bechiyutam. Let's say you stuck your hands into the water to clean your hands. Yadav tahar, certainly your hands are tahar. Peris bechiyutan. Over here the peris are going to be bechiyutan. Why? Because you have nichusa for the water, not on the fruit, but on your hands. But that's enough. The hilchas machshirim. But what do you see from here? L'chura, you see from this Mishnah that if you stick your hands inadvertently into water and they were tameh, when you pull your hands out, they're going to be tar. So you see clearly, l'chayra, this halacha that tefillah works, afilu shalei b'kavan. But it's Rav Nachman. Rav Asakash Rav Nachman from a Gemara Mesechtes Chagiga. Tov al Chulin, v'huchzak l'chulin. If somebody was tov al Chulin, v'huchzak. Now Rashi says huchzak over here means he had kavana to be metaher his hands for Chulin. The halach is he could eat Chulin, but also l'maisa he's not allowed to eat maisa. Maisa sheni he can't eat. Says the Gemara huchzak and huchzak l'chulin. It sounds like the only time that the tahira works, the tefillah works for Chulin is if he was huchzak l'chulin. So you see clearly you have to have kavana. The Gemara says this is the way you read it. Afal pisha huchzak l'chulin, tava l'chulin, not v'huchzak l'chulin. You don't have to be huchzak l'chulin. You don't have to have das v'chulin. What it means that even if you had das v'chulin, still asal l'maiser, it's going to be asal l'maiser. Ace another kasha. Tava v'lei huchzak, kilu loy taval. If someone toiveled, v'lei huchzak, he didn't have das, it's as if he didn't toivel. My lav kilu loy taval klal. Doesn't it mean it's as if you didn't toivel at all? Not even for chulin. The Gemara says like kilu loy taval l'maiser, aval taval l'chulin. It's as if you didn't toivel l'maiser, but it is considered a tefillah l'chulin. So Rav was asking these kashas to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman was deflecting all the kashas. The Gemara says, that when Rava was discussing this with Rav Nachman, he walked away thinking, no, I think I'm asking good kashas. Rav Nachman's deflecting it, but it could be I'm right. Says the Gemara, nafak, dog vashkach. But then Rava sat in his medrash, he went through the sugya, and he found that some mefurish brayso. The Tanya, tav avaloi huchsik. If someone toiveled, and he didn't have any das, what's the halacha? Mutter lechulin, the aser meiser. So it's a mefurish brayso. Bottom line. So we had a machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yechon, a nida who ba'oines ends up in a mikvah, and she now toivel. Is it a good tefillah or is it not a good tefillah? Rav said it depends. Tahira lebeisa, she's mutter to her husband, but asur lecha b'truma. She's not allowed to eat truma. What's the difference? Her husband is chulin. Tefillah shalei midas is considered a tefillah with regards to chulin. Truma is kachin. A tefillah shalei midas is not considered tefillah as relates to kachin. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Aflo beisa leitara, a tefillah shalei midas heisnish kain tefillah." It's not a tefillah not for chulin. It's certainly not going to be a tefillah for kachin. And after the Gemara went through many mishnayos and brises and Gemaras, the Gemara came out. Rava found a brisa that seems to support Rav. The brisa said clearly, "Taval v'loy huchsik." If someone was tamei and he toifel and he had no das to do a tefillah, what's the halacha? Mutter l'chulin v'asel l'maisa. So says the Gemara, what's the next question that the Gemara is going to ask? Amalei abai l'Rav Yosef, le'met yavet tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan, meha l'chura, it's a tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan. Yechon can argue with a brisa, and this is a mefurish brisa, where the brisa says that you don't have to have das for tefillas chulin. So the Gemara says, Amalei, so he told him, Rabbi Yechon, Rabbi Yonason ben Yosef. It's true, Rabbi Yechon doesn't shtim with this brisa, but there is a Tana, the Messiah, the Rabbi Yochanan. Who is that? The Tanya, Rabbi Yonason ben Yosef Omer, and the context over there is a beged that has a nega. So a person could become a Mitzayra, a bias could become a Mitzayra, and a beged could become a Mitzayra as well. The halach is if a beged has a nega, you bring it to the kohen looks at it, he washes it, he tells you to wait 7 days. If after 7 days the nega is still there, he washes it a second time. And the pasuk over there says it's discussing the second time we're washing this beged, without all the details of the halacha, and it says v'chubas shenis, she'll wash it since Feitin Mo, V'tar it's going to be tar. And the Gemara asks, I mean, if you're holding cheshbon in those psukim, just by being Mavas Sedra, listening to the Balkair on Shabbos, you know already up to the second kvisa. So why does it have to say V'chubas shenis? Says the Gemara, the first tachbaisus had to happen last. The pasuk says V'tziva HaKoyen. The Koyen is going to preside over this washing. He's going to be standing there. He's going to say you have to wash it. You can't just fall into a mikvah. No, or into the washing machine. It's something that the kohen has to oversee. Now, by the second kvisa, it doesn't say that. But we learn, in the first kibbutz, the kohen presided over. Maybe the second kibbutz as well. The last word in the pasuk is v'tar mikomakim, to tell me somebody has to have das. Not the good. But what do you see from here? You see that tefillah, kibbutz, needs das. This was Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef. He obviously argues with that price, because our price said that tefillah l'chulin doesn't need das. Over here we're discussing cleaning this beged, even for chulin, and unless somebody has das at the time that you wash the nega out of this beged, it's not going to be considered a tahira. So you see, tahira, it's not tefillah, it's a little different, but tahira needs das. Bottom line is, this is a brisa that supports Rabbi Yonasan. Says the Gemara, Maskeflo Rav Shimi Barashi Umi Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. We have one problem, and now it ties back into our sugya. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say? Is it true? Is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan holds that tefillah l'chulin is bayidas? And even though there's a stam brisa that says loy bayidas, he holds like this one sheet to Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef, who brought a raya from the laws of a beged that has taras. You know what the problem is? Our Mishnah. Because Rabbi Yochanan said halacha stam Mishnah. V'tnana, we learned in our Mishnah, nafla sakin de shachta, afal pisha shachta kedarga, psula, v'avina ba, time of the nafla. And the Gemara made the deal. Only because the sakin fell out in the hand of the shoichet, there was no koyach gavra, that's why it's a pasul shchita. He pilo huk. But let's say he would have dropped it on the floor, there would have been a koyach gavra, would have been kosher. V'afagav to loy mechad. And we said, mantan loy bayi kavanah l'shchita, v'amay rav Rab Nasan. And at the Mishnah, we said it's going to Rab Nasan that you don't have to have kavanah. Now, our Mishnah is discussing chulin, right? We're learning Masechtas Chulin. So we're discussing shchitas chulin. So you see that shchitas chulin, tahira for shchitas chulin is loy by kavanah. Interesting kasha. So freak the Gemara kasha. Rabbi Yochanan, we know Paschal is like every stam Mishnah in Shas. That is Rabbi Yochanan shita in Shas. Halacha stam Mishnah. We have a stam Mishnah that shchitas chulin is loy by kavanah. It's true, it's Rab Nasan, but the Stam Mishnah in Masechtas Chulin, Daf Beis Amud Aleph, Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, is all Rab Nasan, who holds that Shchitas Chulin is loy by kavanah. So why then should Shchitas Chulin be loy by kavanah, yet Tvila of a Tamei Lechulin by kavanah? And the Gemara it's a stira. First, let's two different halachas. One, we're discussing a nida who's Tamei. She did tefillah, shaloi b'kavana. Is it a tahira legabe chulin or is it not? Here we're discussing shchita. Obviously, in the Gemara, there's some commonality between tefillah and between shchita. We're not going to have time to talk about this today. That's Hashem on Sunday. But for now, what we need is the Gemara thinks it's chulin and chulin. Gzeir shava chulin. That both chulin. In one case, you're shechting chulin. In the other case, you're toiveling for chulin. Yet, in our Mishnah, you see you're loy by kavana. And we know Rabbi Yochanan Paschal is like every single stam Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan here holds like Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef, who holds that a tefillah l'chulin is by kavana. Says the Gemara, you have to say b'shchita. I feel Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef. When it comes to shchita, even Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef is going to agree. Thus, it's not going to be a stira. Meaning, there is a chilik between tefillah l'chulin and between shchitas chulin. How do you know that? Meaning, what's the premise for that? The Gemara in Sfara doesn't like it. So we need a makar. Says the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Because midagali rachman misaseg b'kachim pasul. We know that Allah is if someone was misaseg, somebody shechted, but he didn't realize he was doing a shchita. By kachim, it's pasul. And the Gemara learns it out from a pasuk. That's really the punchline of the Gemara. Rashi says, D'chsiv l'rtzonchem tizbechu. And we learn from there, l'daitchem zevuchu. It's learned out from a pasuk that misasek b'kachim is possible. Now, if every single shchita b'misasek was not a good shchita, do I need a pasuk misasek b'kachim? You know what you see from there? Michlal d'chulin loybin in kavana. You see, when it comes to chulin, it's different. So it's true. Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef holds that tefillah is by kavana. He learns it out from a pasuk. He also holds that shchitas chulin is loy by kavana. He learns it out from a pasuk as well. The pasuk that says misasek b'kachim is possible is the makar that misasek b'chulin is kosher. In other words, chulin loy by kavana. The Rabbanon who argue with Rav Nasan, the Rabbanon who hold that chulin is by kavana, right? Our Mishnah we said is Rav Nasan here. The Rabbanon argue. Now that we have a pasuk, misasik bekachim pasuk michlal dechulin loibina kavana, what are the Rabbanon going to do with that pasuk? So the Gemara says nehida loibina kavana l'zvicha. It's true. You see from that pasuk that only by kachim is misasik pasuk. I mean, only by kachim do you have to have kavana to do shchita. But lechaticha beinan. So you could prove from there that you don't have to have kavana to do a shchita, quote unquote. But at the very least, you have to have kavana to do a chaticha, to be cutting a piece. But if you just threw a knife on the floor, then you didn't even have kavana for to do a Maisa Chaticha, that's going to be worse. Amar Rava, and Rava concludes this discussion, as far as we're concerned, the Gemara continues, but for now, Amar Rava, Baha Zakinu Reb Nassan l'Rabbanon, that it's that last line where Reb Nassan was able to prove the Rabbanon wrong. Why? Because Miksiv v'chatachta, meaning you're acknowledging that there's a pasuk that says Mesasik b'kachim's pasuk mechada b'chulin is kasher. So you see there's an idea of chulin loy boy kavana. That's Reb Nassan Shita. What are the Rabbanim going to say? It's true, you don't need kavana for zvicha, but you do need kavana for chaticha. Tainid Reb Nassan, it doesn't say the chatacht anywhere in the Torah. When you're coming up with this spout that you need kavana for chaticha, you just don't even. It says in the Torah, had it said the chatacht, I hear, but it doesn't say that. Memeli bin kavana lechaticha, I feel zvicha nami libai, and Eloi bin kavana lezvicha lechaticha nami libai. What we should be concerned with is zvicha, not chaticha. I don't know. Chaticha has nothing to do with anything, said Reb Nassan. And the Gemara said, Rava said that was the checkmate argument. You see, all the Stam Mishnayos are like Reb Nassan. Why was Reb Nassan right? He's a Das Yachid. You think the Chachamim would have been right over Reb Nassan? Because he had a great argument. What was his argument? That you see from Mesasik B'Kachim Pasol, that Mesasik B'Chulin must be kosher. The Rabbanan wanted to be mechalek between Kavana L'Chaticha versus Kavana L'Zvicha. Reb Nassan said, had it said in the Torah V'Chatachta, I would accept that. But it doesn't say the word V'Chatachta anywhere in the Torah. As a result, it's either Zvicha and Chaticha, or it's no Chaticha, no Zvicha. And if you see that Mesasik B'Kachim is possible, must be that Shchita is loy boy Kavana, period. So there's a lot that we can focus on the daf that we just learned. But I think it's kedai to go back to some raid that we spoke at the beginning of the Masechta. It's already a month ago. And in Beis Medrash without many chedushim. And that is the Noda B'Yehuda in his second tshuva in Yoreh De'ah. So it's Yoreh De'ah. Shailos tshuva is Noda B'Yehuda, Siman Beis. The Shayol asked the Noda B'Yehuda Akasha on the Hilchas Eretz Yisrael that all the Rishonim quote in the beginning of Masechtas Chulin. So let's just read Chazer over the Lashon of the Mordechai, and we'll get into it. Mordechai says as follows: Kasav Rabbeinu Baruch, Ra'isi Kasav Hilchas Shchita, Shehevi Rab Eldad ben Machli, Haba Me'aseres Hashvatim. So there was a Yid, Rab Eldad ben Machli. Most of the Rishonim referred to him as Eldad Hadani. He was from Shevet Dan. He emerged one day in the Haimisha Kreisen. He said that he lives in a faraway village. He spoke about the Sabatyin River, etc., etc. We spoke at the Chidah last week, where the Chidah says that Shevet Yisachar was sitting and learning. As we all know, Yisachar Zvulun, but regardless, he comes from the Aseres Hashvatim and he brings halachas with him. And one of the halachas that he brought was Hilchas Shchita. So he says as follows: Amar Yeshua mipi Moshe mipi Agvura. This is Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. Kala zevech Lashem. If somebody shechts the ini yodeya Hilchas Shchita, asol lechem mishchi tasai. Yeshua ben Nun continued: Kol tabach sheyishchoit Shchita she'ina aguna bein bebehema ichaya oif pigolhu. It's pigol. Lo yeyachal, you're not allowed to eat it, even though we're discussing shchitas chulin. V'lo yishchait ad sheyifnei la kodesh l'makom tefila. A shochet shouldn't shecht unless he davens first. V'im yishchait b'loy bracha, if a shochet chulin is going to shecht without a bracha, pigolu, it's going to be pigol. V'im yishchait arum, if he's not going to wear clothing while he does the shchita, pigol. V'im shikr, if he's under the influence, pigol. V'im shachat lo yehalav sudar al roishe, he wasn't wearing a yarmulke, pigol. V'im lo yhurchatz mishich vazera, if he's a balkari, v'shachat pigol. And then he continued. He said an ovel's not let a shecht. V'ashchita asura miyad isha, miyad soris, miyad zokein. Once he turns 80 years old, uminar achi yimal yudches shana, and the minimum age for shchita is 18. Now, the most famous excerpt of this Hilchas Eretz Yisrael is that he said that a isha is not let a shecht. And Tosfos asks the Kash, the first Tosfos in Masechtas Chulin. The Mishnah says hakol sheichten chutz micher sheite v'katan. It sounds like even an isha, which is the like Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. But the Shayol asked the Rebbe Yehuda from a different part of the Brisa, a different part of Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. Because one of the things he said is that if somebody would shecht beloy bracha, pigol who, it's going to be pigol. His kasha was that the Mishnah says, but even a cheresh v'katam, if there's a gadol oimid al gabav, if a cher maroy noisim, it's going to be okay. Now a cheresh is an enoi shemeya ve'enoi medaber. If he's an enoi medaber, it means he can't make a bracha. So this kasha was that how could a cheresh an enoi shemeya ve'enoi medaber shecht as long as a cher maroy noisim l'chura according to the Hilchas Eretz Yisrael it's a possible shchita, it should be pigel. So Noda B'Yehuda wrote back. He said, first of all, I don't know why you're asking me kashas on Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. We don't paskin like Hilchas Eretz Yisrael. So why are we gonna spend time and get excited over the fact that we have a kasha on Hilchas Eretz Yisrael? Since when do we paskin like this Hilchas Eretz Yisrael? But Says the Noda Yehuda, Afal Pikain, Ledvarav Shehiksha. Now that you asked the question, let's talk about it a little bit. It says the Noda Yehuda that emphasis, I'll ask you another kasha, because we have a sugya, we just learned it right now, where the Gemara discusses if somebody shechts shaloi b'kavana, according to Reb Nassan, which is the Stam Mishnah, shchitas like sheirut. So for example, if somebody throws a knife against the wall, or if somebody throws a knife on the floor, and he just so happens he shechted, it's kasha. In that case, says the Noda Yehuda, did the person make the bracha? Of course he didn't make the bracha. And still you see the halach is, the shchit is going to be kasha. According to the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, it's pigel. Says the Noda Yehuda, you have to say a chiddush. And the Noda Yehuda is miyashiv the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael. He says, what do you mean the brachas? Why would the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael say that if you shecht without a bracha, it's going to be pigel, or the shchita is going to be possible? Since when do you find that a birchas hamitzvos should be ma'akiv in the shchita? Says the Noda Yehuda, you know what the pshat is? Of course the bracha is not really ma'akiv in the shchita. But we know that someone that's a mummer l'shchita, if somebody is not zahir in hilchas shchita, he's a mummer, he's a chashud with regards to anything shchita related, unless it's l'teyavit. But if a person is a mummer for anything shchita related, the halach is he becomes pasal shchita. If somebody doesn't make the bracha of hilchas shchita, says the Noda Yehuda, becomes a mummer l'shchita, that's why it's going to be a problem. So that's only true, says the Noda Yehuda, if a person gets up to shech, then he says, he's a loy baruch b'atayra tchila. Oh, a person like that, and a chanami, that's going to be an issue. But he says, this person who threw a knife against the wall, and it just so happened, was he like baruch b'shchita tchila? No, he would have made a bracha. He wasn't trying to shech. Or if a person threw a knife on the ground, or a cheresh she'enei shemei aveinu medaber, being that he's not a mummer, it doesn't make him a chashid. The halacha, the principle of the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael of Eldad Hadani ben Machli is not going to apply. It only applies, says the Noda Yehuda, if you do it b'kavana, because it's all predicated on the fact that you established a chashid or a mummer by doing that. Otherwise, it's not going to be an issue. But we also spoke out a tshuva nifla from Rav Hersh Pesach Frank. What's in Pesach Frank in his Hartzvi? In Yeridea, it's Simin Beis. And he said a beautiful teretz based on the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is the Masechtes Brachas. It's right in the beginning of Perek Ketzad Mevarchet. The Yerushalmi says, Minayin shekol ha-mitzvahs to unois bracha. How do you know that every mitzvah that a person does, before he does it, he has to make a bracha? Rav Tanchuma, Rabbi Yudah Bar Kahana, B'Shem Rabbi Los. It says in the Torah, "Ve'etna l'cha es luchais ha'even v'atayra v'amitzvahs." Hikish Torah l'mitzvah. Ma Torah tuna bracha, birchas ha'Torah, af mitzvah to unais bracha. Says Rav Hersh Pesach Frank, and others make the diak as well, that l'churi, you see in this Yerushalmi a very big chiddush, because the Gemara says in Masechtes Brachas daf tes vav amid aleph, and this is something that everybody knows, and that is birchas hamitzvos amid rabbanon. So if somebody has a suffix whether he did a mitzvah or has to do a mitzvah, so what do? You do the mitzvah, but you don't make the bracha, because the mitzvah is deraisa, the bracha is the rabbanon. Birchas ha-mitzvah, even for a mitzvah deraisa, is of course only the rabbanon. This Yerushalmi, it sounds like birchas ha-mitzvah is deraisa. The Yerushalmi says, how do you know that mitzvahs require bracha? It's learned out from a hekesh. Ve'etna l'cha es luchais ha'even v'atayra v'mitzvahs. When makish Torah l'mitzvah, ma Torah, just like Birchas HaTorah is a mitzvah. And by the way, Birchas HaTorah is deraisa. Af mitzvah to una bracha. So we're learning Birchas HaMitzvah from Birchas HaTorah, which is a din deraisa. And the Gemara learns it from a pasuk. It's learned that from a hekesh. It's one of the Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah in the Drashos back. So it certainly sounds like from this Yerushalmi that Birchas HaMitzvahs is the Eiraisa. It sounds like that's the Shittas of Yerushalmi. Now, when we spoke at the Hartzvi the first time, we spoke at the abridged version. We're going to speak out the more extended version now. It says Rav Hersh Pesach, if that's the case, I want to tell you a Dover Nifla. The Gemara Masechtes Brachas daf tes vav amud aleph. The Mishnah over there discusses if someone said Kriya Shema, but v'lo hishmiya la'oznai. So he whispered it so quietly that he couldn't even hear what he was saying. Hakoris Shema v'lo hishmiya la'oznai yotza. Rabbi Yossi says lo yotza. You're not yotza. Says the Gemara, despite the fact that Rabbi Yossi holds that when you read Kriya Shema, and if you don't hear the words that you're reciting, you're not yoytze the mitzvah's Kriya Shema. There's another shittas Rabbi Yoshi. That Rabbi Yoshi is a Mishnah in Masechtes Trumos. The halacha over there was discussing a cheresh hamidaber ve'enoi shemeya. So this is not the cheresh as in the cheresh sheit v'katan. The cheresh sheit v'katan is a enoi shemeya ve'enoi medaber. This is a cheresh hamidaber ve'enoi shemeya. The halacha is lo yitroim. He should not be mafresh truma ve'im toram truma say truma. And the Gemara comes out that the town of that Mishnah is Rabbi Yoshi. And the Gemara asks a kasha, because if Rabbi Yossi holds that when you say Kriya Shema, you have to hear the words, then l'chayra a cheresh hamidaber ve'eno shemeya shouldn't be able to be mafresh truma, because before you mafresh truma, you have to make a bracha. And this cheresh is Eino Sheimeya. He's medaber, he can make the bracha, but he's Eino Sheimeya. And as a result, he has no way of hearing the bracha that he's making. So if he has no way of hearing the bracha that he's making, then shouldn't he be a problem? So like Rabbi Yossi, that you have to hear the words of Krishma. So l'chayra, you have to hear the bracha that you make before you mafresh shuma. Zok the Gemara Hazoi. Ad kan lo come Rabbi Yossi lo yotz el gabi Kriya Shema doiraisa. The Gemara says it's not a kasha. You know why? Because Kriya Shema is doiraisa. And because Kriya Shema is doiraisa, over there's a halacha of hakoris es hashma v'lo yishmi lo oznoi lo yotza avol truma mishum bracha. But truma, we're dealing with the birchas hamitzvos u bracha derabanan. And the bracha is the Rabbanan. V'loi bebracha tal yamilsa mimelo, because it's midrabanan, it's not ma'akiv. So it's true, says the Gemara. Rabbi Yossi, who holds that you have to hear the words of Kriya Shema, holds that any time you need to talk, you have to hear what you're saying. And if you can't hear what you're saying, even if it's because you're a cheresh, hamidaber ve'inei shemei, you're not going to be yotzei. But time is the Gemara that birchas hamitzvus is only midrabanan anyways. Being that birchas hamitzvus is only midrabanan, it's for that reason. It's for that reason, says the Gemara, it's not a problem. And the same Rabbi Yossi who holds that if you say Kriya Shema, you don't hear the words of Kriya Shema, you're not yotzei, holds that if you make a birchas hamitzvus and you don't hear the bracha, it's going to be okay. What do you mean you weren't yotzei? It's true you weren't yotzei the bracha, but the bracha is only midrabanan. Freik the shaykas aryin, freik the pnei Yeshua. It sounds like from the Gemara that the Gemara is saying that it's because the Birchas HaMitzvahs is midrabanan, it's for that reason we don't care about the Birchas HaMitzvahs. As if to say, if the chiyuv to say Birchas HaMitzvahs would be midairaisa, if it would be a chiyuv deiraisa, then we'd have a problem over here. Fake the Shagasari and the Pnei Yeshua, why would it be a problem? Let's say Birchas HaMitzvahs is deiraisa. Let's say. And your person's a cheresh who's medaber v'enei shemeya. He has no way of fulfilling the bracha, because Rabbi Yossi shit is you have to hear what you say, and if you don't hear what you say, it's heisnish geret. Okay, very nice. So you weren't yotzei the bracha, but you still yotzei the mitzvah. Why does the Gemara say that the reason, according to Rabbi Yossi, a cheresh hamidaber v'enei shemeya could be mafresh truma is because the bracha is anyways only midrabanan, so it doesn't matter that he didn't have the bracha. As if to say, if the bracha would be dairaisa, it would bother me that it doesn't have the bracha. Freak the shagasarya and the pnei Yeshua. What do you mean? Even if the bracha is midairaisa, so it would be ma'akiv in the bracha. What does it have to do with the actual afrashas truma? And they blind tzarachin. Says Rav Hirsch Pesach that the reason the shagasarya and the pnei Yeshua blind tzarachin was because in the times of the shagasarya and the pnei Yeshua, the Tosfos Rosh wasn't printed yet. But he says if you go to Yisvarim Shafer and you take the Tosfos Rosh on brachas, he asks the kasha and he answers the kasha. He says a davar noira. He says that you see from this Gemara that the only reason a bracha is not ma'akiv in the mitzvah is because brachas are midrabanan. But enochinami, if the chiyuv bracha would be a chiyuv d'oraisa, it'd be ma'akiv, not just the bracha, it'd be ma'akiv in the mitzvah. It's because brachas are midrabanan that we always bifurcate the mitzvah and the bracha. You could do a mitzvah without a bracha, you miss that on the bracha. But if brachas would be midoraisa, you would not be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to spout the two. Yiddish. So you would have they'd be one and the same. They'd be attached by the hip, and you couldn't do a mitzvah without doing the bracha. Does like the Gemara. Hey, yois birchas mitzvahs is only midrabanan. So it comes out the bracha is not ma'akiv the mitzvah. It's not ma'akiv the mitzvah. That's what you yoitza. But enochanami, if the bracha would be deraisa, it'd be ma'akiv the mitzvah. So it says Rav Tzvi Pesach. It comes out that according to the Yerushalmi that holds birchas mitzvahs is midiraisa, like the Tosfos Rosh, which is muchach from the Shagasari and the Pnei Yeshua's kasha. It comes out that the bracha is ma'akiv. If the bracha is going to be ma'akiv in the mitzvah, says Reb Tzvi Pesach, we can answer the Shoyal's kasha and the Noid of Yehuda and the Noid of Yehuda's kasha, and it's half of it. What was the kasha? The Rav Eldad Hadoni came and he said that's a state in Hilchos Eretz Yisrael that if somebody shechts and he doesn't make a bracha, the halacha is the shechita is going to be pasul. So much so, he says, even though it's chulin, somehow it becomes pigel. I don't think there's a chi of chorus, but it's going to be pigel. And the shoyal asked the kasha, it doesn't make sense. We have rayas from Talmud Bavli that you don't have to make a bracha. Says Reb Tzvi Pesach, it's true. Talmud Bavli holds you don't have to make a bracha because Talmud Bavli is l'shi tasai. That birchas mitzvahs is only midrabanan, and being that it's midrabanan, it's not ma'akiv in the mitzvah. But the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, it came from Eretz Yisrael. It was going with the Talmud Yerushalmi. In fact, it's Yerushalmi in the beginning of Masechtas Chulin. This is the Talmud Yerushalmi. Oh, and Talmud Yerushalmi l'shi tasai. The Talmud Yerushalmi holds that birchas HaMitzvah is Midei Raisa. If it's Midei Raisa, it's Ma'akim in the mitzvah. And Chanami, in the Hilchas Eretz Yisrael, which is going B'Shitas HaTalmud Yerushalmi, the halacha is the bracha is going to be Ma'akim. All the rayas from Bavli? You're right. This is all Bavli. I mean, that's rayas from Bavli. It's the Bavli L'Shitasi that holds Birchas HaMitzvahs with the Rabbana, like the Gemara says in Brachas Daf Tezvavam and Aleph. And it's like, and the Yerushalmi is L'Shitasi. The Yerushalmi, the beginning of Perek Ketzim Mevarchim in Mesachtes Brachas that holds that Birchas HaMitzvahs is Midei Raisa. But we're just getting started. I found in the Minchas Usher, so it's in Parshas Kisavai. So he says as follows. It's Be'inyan Birchas HaMitzvahs. And in Ois Beis, he says as follows. V'hine, zechurani sheshamati bebachrusi mimoyer v'rebi kvoit kedushas ha'admer mitzant Kloisenberg zeichet tzadik levracha shapirish mashakos v'atoyser rosh mesechtes Chulin, and he brings the Har Tzvi's tshuva in Yeridei Siman Beis almost verbatim, which is very big chiddush to me. But either way, he brings this whole kasha that the Neighbor asked in a tshuva from the Hilchas Eretz Yisrael for all the Gemaras in Talmud Bavli, Shchita Levay Kavana, what happened to the bracha? And he says he heard a teretz from his Rebbe, the Admir Mitzas Kloisenberg Zatzal, and the teretz was mamish the Har Tzvi's teretz. So, Ha'ara number one, I'm not sure why he doesn't bring the Har Tzvi, but he's very, very myrich in this. And at the end, he says as follows. He says he found in the Kamarna Siddur, Besiddha Kamarna, Huva B'Shem HaGoyin HaKodesh, Reb Isaac Mikarmana, Zechet Tzadik Levracha, Shara L'Rabbi Balateretz Tzvi Mizidachov, Shekibed Li'imoy B'Koy Shomayim. So this was Reb Isaac Mikamarna, who once saw his Rebbe, the Ateretz Tzvi Mizidachov, who was giving a glass of water to his mother. And before he gave his mother the glass of water, you ready? He made a bracha B'Shem HaMalchus. He said, Asher Kedishonu B'Mitzvayse V'Tzivanu Al Kibud Avoyev. As I state in this Kamarna Siddur, and says the Minchas Usher, Upli in Eskavi. How can you make such a bracha? Now the truth is that the Rishonim asked the kasha, why don't we make a bracha? The Rashba was asked the kasha in the tshuva, and the Rashba said a teretz, but it doesn't matter what the teretz is. Halacha l'maisa, you don't make a bracha. You don't make a bracha. So what's going on over here? Stating the Kamana Siddur that the Ziddur Chover Rebbe made a bracha b'shem of Malchus on Kibbud Aved. This is the Minchas Usher's kasha. Good kasha, right? So he says pshat like this. He says that we just spoke after Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi learns out from a pasuk, from a hekesh, that Birchas HaMitzvah seems to be dairaisa. Truth is, if you look up the Yerushalmi, it's a very long Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says as follows: Rab Chagi Rabbi Yirmiyah, Solkun Lebeichan Vasa. Rab Chagi and Rabbi Yirmiyah, they once entered a store. Kofatz Rab Chagi ubirach aleim. Rab Chagi jumped up and he made a bracha. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah told Rab Chagi, Yo savdus. Say you're good. Shekol ha-mitzvah is to unais bracha. Because every single mitzvah needs a bracha. Beer. So the Charedim, as in the Bala Charedim, who was a contemporary of the Beis Yosef and the Arizal and Rav Moshe Cordovero. So the Charedim wrote a pirush on Yerushalmi. We have it on two Masechtas. We have it on Masechtas Brachas and we have it on Masechtas Beya. So the Charedim and his pirush on the Yerushalmi, most Yerushalmis have it. On this Yerushalmi right here says what happened was as follows. Rab Chagi and Rab Yirmiyah went into the store. They wanted to check the midos and the mishkalos. The pasuk says Moisnei Tzedek, Avnei Tzedek, Ifas Tzedek, Hin Tzedek. Right, you have to make sure that you're ehrlich when you do business. So they were going to check to make sure that it was Moisnei Tzedek and Avnei Tzedek and Ifas Tzedek and Hin Tzedek. The Kofatz Rab Chagi, and Rab Chagi got up, Ubirech, and he made the bracha. The following bracha: Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu livdai kamidos v'hamaz Naim ulesakin hasha'arim. Unbelievable. And what did Rabbi Yirmiyah tell him? Yos Abdus. Very, very good. Shekol ha-mitzvah is too nice bracha. Because every single mitzvah needs a bracha. Now the Charedim continues. He says, Came matzasi the Rabbeinu Eliyahu. He says, I saw by Rabbeinu Eliyahu. And the Minchas Osher says, Rabbeinu Eliyahu is definitely Rabbeinu Eliyahu, who was the mechaber of the Reishis Chachma, who was the Rebbe of the Charedim. So this is the mechaber of the Reishis Chachma. We're dealing with Kedoshim here. He says, Came matzasi Rabbeinu Eliyahu. Show you Mavarich, show you noising tzedakah. He used to make a bracha before he gave tzedakah. Or malvala ani, v'chein b'chol ha-mitzvahs. V'loi nagu kein ha'olam. The minig ha'olam is not that way. Ela b'miktas mitzvahs mavarchim, u'b'miktas ein mavarchim. V'kval nishal ha-rashba l'adova. The Rashba was asked this kasha. V'nidchak losis tam. A lot of the teruts and why we don't make brachas on different mitzvahs comes from a Rashba and a tshuva. And he quotes this Rashba right here. And he was nidchak, says the Charedim. The Rashba was losis tam, man nishtanu elu mehelu. But here's the bottom line. That this minig of the Ateretz Tzvi Miziditchoiv, who was Mechaber his mother. He said, "Ashek Shalom Mitzvahs if it's Ivan, I'll keep it Aveim." Already has a Makar and a Kadmoin. The Baal Reishis Chachma. He used to make a bracha when he used to give tzedakah, when he used to be Malva La'ani, and it really has a Makar in Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says that Rab Chagi once made the bracha Ashek Yishonim Mitzvahs if it's Ivan, Livdei Kamidos V'Amiznaim Ulesakin Asharim. Says the Minchas Usha. You know what I think is going on over here? I think what's going on over here is the Yerushalmi's all the Shitasai, because the Yerushalmi holds that brachas amidairaisa, and if a chiv to make a brachas mitzvahs is dairaisa, I don't think you could stop being mechalik. This mitzvah yes, this mitzvah no. All these tshuvas that the Rishonim and the Achreidim talk about, these are all very nice when you're dealing on a D'Rabbanan level, but when you're dealing on a dairaisa level, it becomes very, very dachak. So the Yerushalmi that holds the brachas mitzvahs is dairaisa. And by the way, what's the lashon Yerushalmi? Minayin shekol mitzvah is tunais bracha. Say you make a bracha from Moisnei Tzedek and Avnei Tzedek and Eifat Tzedek and Hin Tzedek, and you can make a bracha like the Reishis Chachma did when you give tzedakah, and you can make a bracha like the Baal Teretz Tzvi Miziditchoiv did when he was Mekayim Kibbut Avei. The Bavli holds that it's only midrabanan. Being that it's only midrabanan, so the Hey Mamru, the Hey Mamru, and that's why we have all these different chalukim. He concludes this piece. He says, "V'hinei afagaftule nisyashiv min exal liba the hilchas." Of course, we don't pass like the Yerushalmi. Uman the oven hachi einoi elamin amatmian. It's not something you should do. Don't try this at home. Mikomak and kiven the meiser rav the goyim v'tzadiku. Being that I heard the story from the Rebbe from Miziditchoiv, I felt like chasachti mi bati sfasai lahoyer ki nimtzolei base of b'divrei kadmonim. I had to find that at the very least, even though it's a tmiyah, but there's at least a makar in the kadmonim, a makar in the Reishis Chachma, a makar in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Either way, it's more to talk about, but it's about Shabbos.